They called him the man who could make a guitar cry. Keith Urban, a name that once meant safety, melody, devotion. For decades, he was the gentle heartbeat of country music, the husband every woman dreamed of, the man who sang of love not as fantasy, but as forgiveness. When he stood beside Nicole Kidman, the world saw grace made human. Two Australians, two survivors, two stars burning in the same light. But even light, when it burns too long, begins to cast a shadow. It started quietly, as these things always do. A glance that lasted too long, a smile that carried something unsaid, a performance that felt too alive. The audience saw it before he did. On a night filled with golden lights and champagne laughter, Keith Urban shared the stage with a woman whose voice was both innocence and fire, Kelsea Ballerini. She was the rising princess of country pop, half his age, but carrying the same kind of ache in her tone that had once made him famous. Their duet began as a tribute, just a simple merging of voices. But as the music unfolded, something electric happened. Not between the instruments, but between souls. The way he looked at her wasn't mentorship. It was memory. It was recognition. The crowd felt it, so did the cameras. Twitter burned before the final note faded. Did you see that? The way he looked at her? It wasn't just a song. Rumors flooded faster than melodies. Studio insiders whispered about late-night sessions, lyrics too personal to be fiction, text exchanges filled with creative metaphors that sounded a little too intimate. Every time Keith spoke about a new wave of inspiration, people couldn't help but wonder who that wave was. In his latest concert, he introduced a song called Whispers in the Rain. It wasn't on any album, it wasn't planned, just him, his guitar, and words that felt like a confession wrapped in poetry. She came like thunder wrapped in quiet, he sang, and I forgot the sound of my own silence. Fans gasped. Nicole Kidman smiled in the audience, but her eyes lingered a second too long, as if she too had heard the truth hidden in the melody. The press went feral. Is this art, or is this the beginning of something real? Keith laughed it off. It's just music, he said. But in Nashville, people know better. Music has always been where truth hides. Behind every glittering award shelf lies a story no one dares to sing. Behind every legend is a moment when the heart decides to betray its own peace. And for Keith Urban, the man who once promised the world that love could be eternal, a single connection now threatened to rewrite his entire song. The question that haunts every fan tonight isn't whether he loves or sins, but whether he's still the same man he once sang about. And in that uncertainty, the city listens, waiting for the next note, the next truth, the next heartbreak set to a perfect tune. Before the sold-out stadiums and the flash of platinum lights, there was a small boy standing barefoot in the red dust of Queensland, Australia. A child with tangled blonde hair holding a guitar too big for his body and a silence too heavy for his years. His name was Keith Lionel Urban, born in Whangarei, New Zealand in 1967, to a father who drove trucks and a mother who sold hope in the form of cheap trinkets. Their family moved constantly, chasing work, chasing a future that never quite arrived. His father, Robert, was strict and tired, a man hardened by unfulfilled dreams. His mother, Marianne, had music in her veins, but sorrow in her eyes. When arguments echoed through the small house, Keith would slip outside, clutching the guitar she'd found at a pawn shop, his refuge carved from 6 steel strings. He learned early that love could vanish without warning. Money ran out, promises broke. The world never apologized. At school, other boys mocked his accent, his quietness, his obsession with songs by Johnny Cash and Don Williams, music no one his age understood. Yet the rhythm of country music spoke to him in a language deeper than words. It was the sound of truth, he would later say, rough, raw, and real. By 10, he was performing at local fairs, his tiny hands moving across the frets like they were maps to another life. The applause filled the emptiness he didn't yet know how to name. But every night, when the noise died down, the same ache returned, that small whispering voice asking if he'd ever be enough. His father pushed him harder, play cleaner, sing louder, don't mess it up. Praise rarely came, correction was constant. Each criticism left a scar, but also a strange hunger, a need to prove, to please, to perform. It was the seed of perfectionism that would one day win him Grammys and cost him peace. When adolescence came, so did the chaos. Alcohol first entered his world not as pleasure, but as permission to stop feeling for a moment. He saw adults drink to forget, and soon he learned to do the same. By 17, he could outplay most musicians twice his age and outdrink them too. The two gifts grew together like twins born of pain. And yet, amid the noise, there were flashes of grace. His mother's voice humming from the kitchen, the smell of rain on the tin roof, the first time he heard applause that wasn't pity, but awe. Those were the moments that told him there was something larger waiting, something sacred in sound itself. One night, after another argument between his parents, he sat alone on the porch, guitar on his lap, moonlight on his hands. He whispered to himself, "Someday, I'll play for people who listen." It wasn't ambition. It was survival. That vow would follow him across oceans, across heartbreaks, across the dark corners of fame. Every note he would one day play, every lyric about longing and redemption was born from that lonely boy, the one who learned that music was the only language that never lied. Dreams are easy to chase when you have nothing to lose, and Keith Urban had already lost almost everything that could be taken from a boy. What remained was the ache to prove that pain could sound beautiful. He left home before most kids his age had even decided what they wanted to be, with a second-hand guitar, a duffel bag, and faith stitched together from scraps. He started performing in tiny bars across Queensland. The air was always thick with cigarette smoke and cheap whiskey, but when he sang, even the drunks went quiet. There was something in his voice, something raw, cracked, and holy. For years, he lived out of motels and borrowed couches, playing anywhere they'd let him. He was paid in coins, beer, and sometimes silence. When people clapped, he smiled. When they didn't, he sang harder. His calluses turned into armor. His loneliness turned into melody. But Nashville, that was the dream. The city of legends, the place where hearts were broken in harmony. He'd seen it in magazines, heard its name whispered like a spell. So he saved every cent, sold his old car, and bought a one-way ticket to America. It wasn't what he expected. Nashville wasn't golden, it was gray. Every corner was filled with singers better than him, hungrier than him. He spent nights sleeping in a friend's basement, scribbling lyrics on pizza boxes. Record labels turned him away. Too foreign, too raw, too risky. The polite smiles cut deeper than insults. But he refused to surrender. Music was no longer a dream. It was the only way out. He played in empty bars for strangers who didn't care. And yet, somewhere in the haze of rejection, something extraordinary happened. People started to remember his name. His guitar solos were lightning. His voice, smoke and fire. He didn't sound like Nashville. He sounded like every emotion Nashville had forgotten. By the late 1990s, he caught the ear of Capitol Records. His first album, simply titled Keith Urban, landed in 1999 and changed everything. But for the Grace of God shot to #1, and suddenly, that barefoot boy from Caboolture was the new prince of country music. Yet with fame came ghosts. The faster he rose, the louder the noise inside him grew. He started to drink more. Success, it turned out, was just another addiction with a prettier bottle. By the 2010s, Keith Urban was no longer just a country singer. He was a myth in motion. His concerts weren't performances, they were pilgrimages. Fans came not only to hear his voice, but to feel the pulse of their own heartbreak reflected through it. Every lyric was a confession, every chord a piece of his soul. Beside him stood Nicole Kidman, ethereal, luminous, steadfast. The world adored them together. Hollywood royalty and Nashville's poet, hand in hand, walking red carpets like they were strolling through heaven itself. They seemed untouchable, proof that love could survive fame, addiction, and the endless spotlight. But even fairy tales tremble when reality begins to hum beneath the music. Fame changed everything. It gave Keith everything he'd ever wanted and took away the one thing he needed most: quiet. Every award, every applause, every sold-out show only reminded him that silence no longer existed. The louder the crowd screamed, the lonelier he felt. Still, he worked relentlessly. He released Fuse, Ripcord, Graffiti U, each album a new layer of brilliance. Critics called him the king of country love. Fans saw him as a savior. But deep inside, Keith was searching again, for meaning, for inspiration, for something that felt alive. That was when Kelsea Ballerini appeared, young, hungry, radiant. She was country music's next flame, a woman whose smile carried the kind of pain only old souls understood. She grew up idolizing him. Posters of Keith covered her teenage bedroom walls. She learned to write songs by copying his lyrics line by line. Their worlds collided when she joined The Voice as a guest mentor. Keith, now the seasoned icon, took her under his wing. What began as guidance slowly turned into something more mysterious, a creative kinship that neither of them could quite explain. She'd call him Mr. Urban at first, shy and polite. He'd laugh and say, "Drop the Mr., it makes me sound ancient." They'd talk for hours about songwriting, rhythm, the way pain shapes beauty. Sometimes silence would stretch between them, not awkward, but electric, the kind of silence that feels like a song waiting to be written. Nicole noticed, of course. How could she not? The way his voice softened when he spoke of Kelsea, the light in his eyes when he mentioned her name. But she stayed graceful, as always. After all, Keith had mentored many artists before. Why should this be different? Then came the award shows, their duets, the chemistry impossible to disguise. When Keith and Kelsea sang together, it wasn't performance, it was conversation. The microphones vanished, the crowd blurred, and for those few minutes, there were only two souls and one rhythm. Social media exploded. Fans wrote theories, tabloids screamed headlines, and every slow-motion clip of their shared gaze became internet gospel. But when asked, both laughed it off. "We're just friends," they said. Yet in every denial, there was hesitation, the kind of pause that truth often hides behind. For Kelsea, it was admiration. For Keith, it was recognition. Two artists at different ends of their careers, one just beginning, one afraid of the end, meeting in the space between what's lost and what's found. Fame is a mirror that reflects both light and shadow. And for Keith Urban, the reflection was beginning to fracture. The applause still thundered, the world still adored him. But somewhere between the encores and the interviews, something inside began to unravel. Once again, his schedule was merciless. Tour after tour, album after album, a constant demand for perfection. His fingers bled on the strings. His voice cracked under fluorescent exhaustion. Yet he kept smiling, because legends don't crumble in public. They bleed in silence. At home, cracks began to show. Nicole's film career pulled her across oceans, their children growing up between cities and time zones. They tried to hold on, but love stretched thin under distance and duty. Keith would return from the road to an empty house, his laughter echoing against marble floors. And then there were the whispers, the same whispers that once haunted him in youth. The temptation of numbness, of just one drink, of quiet oblivion. He had been sober for years, yet addiction waits like an old friend at the edge of every dark thought. In 2022, while Keith battled exhaustion and loneliness, Kelsea Ballerini's marriage to Morgan Evans began to crumble. Her songs turned darker. Her voice trembled with honesty. She spoke openly about pain, about losing herself. When she met Keith again during a Nashville charity show, it was as if the universe had rehearsed the reunion in secret. They spoke backstage, a simple conversation about resilience, heartbreak, and music. But the energy was unmistakable. Two people, both broken in their own ways, found the reflection of their wounds in each other's eyes. What began as mentorship shifted into understanding. Long nights in the studio followed, writing, composing, dissecting emotions that neither dared to name. Their connection was not reckless, it was reverent, like two survivors building a sanctuary out of harmony. Still, the world doesn't forgive tenderness between the married and the lonely. Fans noticed. So did Nicole. The tabloids began circling like vultures. Keith Urban's emotional bond with Kelsea Ballerini, more than music, screamed one headline. Keith stayed silent, but his songs spoke louder than he ever could. His unreleased demo, What the Night Forgot, leaked online, a song about two voices meeting in darkness, finding clarity, then fading before dawn. She was a storm that whispered instead of screamed, and I let her in because silence had become too cruel. Was it truth? Was it fiction? No one could tell. But Nicole's smile at the next award show seemed colder, rehearsed. The world saw elegance. She felt distance. Kelsea, meanwhile, tried to draw boundaries, telling interviewers that Keith was a mentor, a friend, a hero. But heroes can be dangerous when you start believing they understand you more than anyone else. And so what began as inspiration grew into a quiet ache neither could erase. The more they sang, the more it sounded like confession. The more they denied, the more people believed. Behind the curtain, the legend who once conquered addiction found himself addicted again, not to substances, but to connection, to the feeling of being seen by someone who needed him as deeply as he needed redemption. It was the cost of being a legend. You become a symbol for everyone except yourself. And somewhere deep in Nashville, under neon lights and whispered secrets, Keith Urban realized that no melody could save a man from the sound of his own heartbreaking.
Every city has a sound, and in Nashville, the quiet between notes carries its own kind of truth. In that silence, Keith Urban and Kelsea Ballerini had built something neither could define. To the world, it was art. To them, it was survival. They began writing together in hidden studios outside of town, away from the lights, away from eyes that turned every breath into rumor. There, stripped of fame and expectation, they spoke not as idol and admirer, but as equals, two weary souls who understood the weight of being adored and misunderstood all at once. She was newly single, rebuilding herself from the ashes of a failed marriage. He was still married, trying to protect the fragile peace he'd promised Nicole years ago. But somewhere between the chords and the quiet laughter, their pain began to rhyme. One night, as rain pattered against the studio roof, they finished a song called "The Quiet Kind of Love." It was haunting, too intimate to be casual, too honest to be fiction. When they played it back, neither spoke. Kelsea wiped a tear from her cheek. Keith turned away, his hand trembling slightly. "We can't release this," he murmured. She nodded. They both knew why. But music has its own rebellion. It refuses to stay buried. Word spread that Keith and Kelsea were crafting something extraordinary, something real. Fans begged for a duet. Producers hinted that the chemistry was unmanufactured. When they performed together again, the stage lights painted them in gold, but their eyes betrayed the calm. The rumors grew teeth, paparazzi photos of them leaving studios late at night, anonymous sources whispering about unspoken feelings. Yet when confronted, both smiled that same wounded smile. It's just art. Nicole, in her quiet grace, stood by Keith at every public appearance. Her hand on his arm looked gentle, but her eyes were searching, not for guilt, but for distance. She once told a friend, "You don't lose a man all at once, you lose him note by note." Still, no scandal ever broke. No proof, no betrayal, just tension, heavy as humidity in July. And in that uncertainty, the myth grew. People didn't need evidence, they needed belief. Because the story of two broken artists healing each other was more intoxicating than truth itself. When Keith finally released "Burning in Silence," fans froze. The lyrics were a confession written in disguise. "You were the calm that felt like chaos, the echo I couldn't unhear. If I never said your name aloud, it's because I never stopped whispering it here." Critics called it his most vulnerable work since Love, Pain, and the Whole Crazy Thing. But to those who listened closely, especially one woman in Tennessee, it sounded like a farewell. In a rare interview, Keith was asked what inspires his songs of late. He paused, smiled faintly, and said, "Sometimes the muse isn't a person. It's what that person awakens in you." And that was all he ever said. Whatever truth lived between him and Kelsea stayed locked within the music, tender, untouchable, eternal. Because some stories aren't meant to be understood, they're meant to be felt. Time has a strange way of blurring the line between what happened and what we only imagined. The headlines have quieted now. The noise has faded into a hum, soft, persistent, almost musical. Nashville has moved on to new gossip, new stars, new songs, but somewhere beneath the surface of that restless city, two names still echo together like a chord that refuses to resolve: Keith Urban and Kelsea Ballerini. Keith is 57 now. The wildness in his eyes has mellowed into something wiser, sadder, more serene. His hair has turned silver at the edges, his voice deeper, his performances slower, more spiritual. When he sings these days, it's less about fame and more about forgiveness. Forgiveness for himself, for the choices he made, and for the silence he kept at his concerts. He still plays the old hits: Somebody Like You, Blue Ain't Your Color, The Fighter. But there's a new tenderness in the way he performs them. It's as if he's singing to ghosts. Sometimes, between songs, he looks into the crowd and smiles that faint, faraway smile, the kind that hides entire chapters behind it. Nicole Kidman stands by him, radiant as ever. She claps, she beams, she holds his hand on red carpets. And maybe that's love. Not perfection, but endurance. The kind of love that stays even when it's been tested by the fire of fame, temptation, and time. She once said in an interview, "You don't stay married to a man like Keith because he's flawless. You stay because you've seen his soul, and you choose it anyway." Kelsea, now in her early 30s, has become a star in her own right. Confident, luminous, finally free. Her songs brim with maturity and quiet wisdom. When asked about Keith in a recent podcast, she smiled softly and said, "He taught me that broken doesn't mean done. Sometimes you meet someone who shows you the parts of yourself you forgot were still beautiful." Then she added, almost to herself, "I hope he knows that the world never got its scandal, never got the confession it wanted. Maybe that's for the best." Because what they shared wasn't betrayal, it was something subtler, more fragile. It was two artists standing in the same emotional storm, recognizing the echo of their own wounds in each other. Keith once said that music is the language of unfinished feelings. Perhaps that's what this was, an unfinished feeling wrapped in melody, carried by time.
Years later, during a benefit concert in Nashville, the impossible happened. Keith was performing alone under a single spotlight when he paused mid-set and invited a special friend to join him. The crowd erupted as Kelsea walked on stage. No one expected it. No one breathed. They sang The Quiet Kind of Love, the song they once promised never to release. It was stripped down, acoustic, trembling with honesty. Every word felt like closure and confession all at once. When the final note lingered in the air, they didn't speak. They simply looked at each other. One long, wordless moment, then smiled and walked off opposite sides of the stage. The crowd stood in silence, not daring to clap yet, because some endings don't need applause, they need reverence. That night, Keith wrote one last line in his journal before sleeping. "Some connections are not meant to be understood, only remembered." And perhaps that's all this ever was, a memory that changed them both, a melody that healed more than it hurt, a chapter hidden but never forgotten. If this story touched your heart, If you've ever loved someone in silence or found yourself in the echo of another soul, then let this song be yours too. Like, share, and subscribe to keep uncovering the hidden chapters of lives lived between fame and feeling, between truth and myth, between heartbreak and grace. Because sometimes the most beautiful stories aren't the ones we tell aloud, but the ones that still sing quietly inside us long after the last note fades.